In today's guide, we show you how to replace all of the spring and shock assemblies on the Porsche Cayenne, front and rear, as complete units. We include required tools and advice when you're at the difficult steps. If anything is missing, check the comments below, since there might be new information there. After replacing the shocks and springs, the ride is much smoother. This is the sway bar link, and those are the two nuts and bolts we'll be working with. I recommend loosening the top nut and bolt combo first, because later on it will give us the mobility we need to get it out of position. I had success holding the back of it with one 18mm wrench and pressing down on the left with another 18mm wrench. If you haven't worked with it recently, it might be quite stuck, so before wrenching, maybe give it a dab of PB Blaster or WD-40. You will most likely need to buy those 18mm wrenches because an adjustable one did not work. You do not need to completely remove the nut like you might see in this video. That was just a learning mistake on my part. With the top nut loosened, let's focus on the bottom bolt next. As you can see, I had some difficulty with breaking it loose, so let me show you a trick how you can use two wrenches to break a stubborn bolt loose. Basically make them parallel, and using a third wrench and holding everything in position carefully, apply the force counterclockwise, so it spins the wrenches counterclockwise, and the bolt should break loose. With that, we can get the bolt the rest of the way. The bolt might be a bit finicky, so here I'm using two wrenches to basically leverage it out, and eventually it breaks loose using a flathead screwdriver between the sway bar link and the bar. Observe that we can move the sway bar link freely because we loosened the top nut first. Next, you need a 21mm socket wrench or breaker bar to remove the lower strut base nut. I had success breaking it loose with an extra large socket set that I'll link below, as well as a torque wrench with a larger, thicker extension on it. I soaked ahead of time with PB Blaster and WD-40, and also to break it loose I did not have to hold it from the other side. I actually gripped it from the front facing the side, where the bolt side, to break the nut loose. Once it was loose, I gripped the other side with an adjustable wrench and kept the bolt in, but got the nut the rest of the way off. But the nut is removed. And we should have kept the nut in on this bar. We could have kept it in, and that would have been better practice on this side as well. Just removing the nut, not the bar itself. There is a correct way to disconnect the brake pad sensor, and then there's the way I attempted to do it the first time around. You're supposed to use a flathead screwdriver to push the slightly lighter gray clip inwards towards the clip to release it, but mine simply broke. The mistake I probably made is using too large a flathead screwdriver on one side. But no worries, we'll show you a fix. And then we go. Pressing against this connector a little bit. This just breaks off with age. This you press up, then you pull down. And this one still clicks in, so we don't have to zip tie it. Cool. Well, this is the exact same way I was applying force on the other one too. It's a shame. Okay, so you get your screwdriver under, and there's a clip on the inside. Supposed to press it like so. And no excessive force needed. Once your small flathead screwdriver pushes in on the clip, simply pull down on the sensor connector wire itself. No excessive force needed. You don't want to cut yourself. Seeing if it's gonna stick when I reinstall it, or whether I have to replace this now. Mine broke off. We can basically pull down and then off. I'm going to need to repair mine. I'll repair it when I do brakes. If you rotate the connector 90 degrees, it becomes removable from the mounting bracket. Next up is the rest of the wiring harness on the upper retainers. I got the lower one out using a twisting motion, and same for the top a little. On the other side is the ABS harness connector, and that's a similar removal mechanism. So first we remove the top portion by jiggling it out. Mine did not jiggle out, so I had to pry it out with a flathead screwdriver. And then to remove the lower connector, we need a small flathead screwdriver inserted from within the connector and applying a little leverage to push in the inner clicky thing. It might be stuck, but don't give up. Keep trying and don't apply too much force. Patience will prevail.
Got it. When it's on, just apply down till it clicks. Then you remove.
Careful, this is your brake line. Pull it out of the steering knuckle on top of this. Like so. Support the lower control arm using a jack. This is in order to remove the upper ball joint nut in the next step. Remove the upper ball joint nut. My ball joint stud did not spin through, but if it does, you can hold it in place using a Torx bit. Separating the upper ball joint was a bit of a challenge. First I tried a ball joint separator, which was too small. Next you can see me trying to use a fork to force it off. If you do so, you have to be mentally prepared to replace the rubber boot on the upper control arm. After everything was said and done, my rubber boot moved up but did not tear or get significantly damaged. So I'm going to continue monitoring it and eventually replace it if the upper control arm fails. That will be another video. But in the end, I found a surefire method that works.
Okay, that did the trick. This is the method that worked. Unfortunately, my rubber boot is not in the bestest of conditions now.
I did not do this because I was able to push the upper control arm out of the way on its own. If you're having trouble with the removal or installation process later in the video, you can go back and loosen the upper control arm in order to more easily insert the new assembly. You can loosen these two bolts holding the upper control arm, move it up, and then tighten them to hold it out of the way. Next, we're going to loosen all 4 strut nuts and remove 3 of the 4. They are 13mm. The front ones are not too hard to reach. The rear ones are a different story.
Give it a few loving taps. Nothing too serious. The bolt should come out. Tilt this back. Finally firmly clasp this. Remove the final bolt. Hold the spring assembly with one arm. Do the 13 on it with the other. We lower the jack, which gives the clearance we need to be able to lift it out. Not bad. This has no boot. Now we just replace the whole assembly. Starting with finally this was installed in the car. At this point, we transfer over the link to the new arm, to the not messed up arm. And if we haven't already, 18mm loosens this nut and bolt. Transfer over to the new one. complete assembly. Nice. Let's reinsert this. Beginning with the bottom end. To the right here. Aiming to get the bottom onto the lower control arm. Once inserted, we do kind of a pivoting motion, making sure to get the sway link bar unstuck. Lower onto this, push the control arm up, push it onto the 4 bolts at the top, and then reinsert one of the nuts by hand, and then reinsert the other nut by hand, and then reinsert the other nut by hand. With the 4 upper nuts installed, we do not want to do anything yet with tightening. What we want to do is jack up the lower control arm such that the hole Next, we want to reinsert the lower control arm bolt. So we can try to get this into position, but as we can see, that might be a little challenging. So we want to jack, using a jack up the lower control arm so the hole aligns with our new arm here. Okay. We've raised a little. We've almost got them aligned right where we want them. Okay, play around with the jack until they're lined up. Give the bolt a loving smack. See why it's not going through on the other end. Okay, so the back needs to be a little more pivoted, like so. So I'm pivoting it. I'm putting on gloves because this is a dangerous maneuver. Wow. So this needs to get pivoted more. So I'm actually using the sway link to rotate it. So I'm getting on the right side. Okay. We have gone through. Now we just put the nut on without tightening. And I put the power tool on the right side to get it all the way through.
Next, we want to jack it up using the lower control arm and make sure that the assembly is seated completely on the studs at the top. We want to make sure the strut assembly is completely seated on the studs at the top to prevent premature wear of the suspension components. Once the assembly is jacked up all the way onto the studs, finish installing the 4 stud nuts and tighten them to 22 foot-pounds. Next, we want to make sure the sway bar end link bolt is reinserted and installed, but not tightened at this time. You can see me try a few suboptimal methods here, but what worked perfectly is just making sure it was jacked up at the right height under the lower control arm. At that point, reinserting the bolt was a simple process, and next we want to loosely install the nut on the sway bar end link bolt. Optionally, you can loosen these upper control arm bolts to get enough play to reinsert the upper ball joint. I had enough motion in mind, so I did not have to loosen these bolts. Let me know in the comments if you think I need new upper control arms, please. Now we adjust these into the position and reinstall this nut as well. I did a little bit of damage to my control arm boot. I see a little bit of fluid here. If I start hearing creaking and noises, we'll do another guide shortly to replace the upper control arm, but I did see this metal exposed for a while, and I wish the boot was in better condition. Control arm into position. Now the nut, this is spinning, so we will have to hold it with our torques. To reinstall this and torque it to 63 foot-pounds, what we will need to do is actually put the torques. We set it to 63 foot-pounds, set up how we want it. Millimeter around it. I got a sturdier Torx bit. That's done. The brake hose goes home, and you want to wear a glove because this thing likes to pinch your fingers. Insert it at the top here. Twist into position. This one, twist it into position. Sensor gets reinserted. To hear a click. Similarly, I broke my clip upon removal. Don't do that. We'll have to get a new one and splice it in. This is from my 987 brake kit, and they do come with new brake sensor connectors with this female connector. Thank you. I don't like doing this, but I also don't like the sensor possibly coming off during driving. So in the interim, hold it in place by doing a crisscross pattern. One across like so, and you want to pre-lower it, assuming it's hopped off during motion and vibration, so as low as possible. And that's not going anywhere. Lift the vehicle to ride height. Use the jack under the lower control arm, and when the Cayenne starts to lift, that means you are at ride height and don't need to jack it up any further. If you loosened the upper control arm bolts earlier on in the video, now's the time to torque them back to 37 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees past 37 foot-pounds.
111 plus 90 degrees. Ah, that is tight. And we didn't even have to watch the other side, it just held on. Very cool. Torque the sway bar bolt to 81 foot-pounds. So that's both sway bar bolts. Since we can't really get a torque wrench around these, I'm going to do my best with my knowledge of how torque normally goes, and go as strong as it goes without stripping the bolt. Good on the visual inspection. Now the lower one we can torque. Got it.
So on the front right, I removed the wheel well liner, but it turns out you definitely do not need to remove it in order to complete this procedure. So here I'm just reinstalling it before putting the wheel back on. And the wheel gets torqued to 118 foot-pounds in the next step when we get the front of the Cayenne down on the ground. Don't forget to admire what you've accomplished. You just did it. So here's a brief chapter on differences between the left and right front sides, because the way I did it one wheel at a time instead of the entire front at the same time. It just seemed simpler to have one wheel up at a time, even though when we do the rear, we actually do have to lift the entire rear. Here's the trick to break the bolts loose not working. I did have to soak all the bolts in WD-40 or PB Blaster because normally they wouldn't budge. The sway bar end link bolt then breaks loose. Also, then the lower strut base bolt also breaks loose with some torque. On this side I broke none of the connectors because now I had the experience of taking off the pad wear sensor as well as the ABS connector. The rest of the wiring harness came right off without issue on this side. And as you might notice, I did not have to remove the wheel well liner in the front, it turns out. So we can just tuck away the wiring into the vent at the front. Brake line comes right out of the bracket without issue. Playing around with the tension under the lower control arm, the sway bar end link bolt slips right out. And the upper ball joint came out without incident as well.
And start removing the 4 nuts at the top, leaving one loosely attached.
Removing the 4 nuts at the top was easy. All I had to do was just a bit more maneuvering with the wheel well liner in place. A little more challenging, but not by much, and definitely doable. See, you can just reach around this part of the wheel well liner here to get to it. With that, we leave one nut loosely attached, and supporting the entire assembly with one arm, remove the nut and pivot it, the whole assembly, right out.
The trick is to have the torque arm loosened at the last step. With the wheel well liner inside, we did drop something inside, but nothing a magnetic tool or hand, luckily, can't reach. I just transfer over to the sway bar link and keep going.
Transferring the sway bar end link is easy, 18 millimeters, and in the exact same orientation it goes on the new strut assembly.
We want it to have the ability to move, but also not to wobble, to not hit the brake line or anything important.
Maneuvering the strut assembly into position with the wheel well liner in place, as you can see, is pretty straightforward. I won't be dismissive and say everything is easy, but once you get the hang of it, it's doable. Don't forget to admire your handiwork. Good job. The rest of the procedure was the same as the other side.
So after an awesome test drive, the front, now I know what it meant to have bad shocks. The front feels miraculous.
The rear shocks still need to be done, and they feel stiff and dead. And this is what a car is supposed to feel like. Driving the car, I'm noticing that when you're coming to a stop at a light or at a stop sign, it does still do the grumble thing when it's downshifting, or it's downshifting smooth. It's still doing the grumble thing a little bit at going from like 5 miles an hour to 0, but you no longer feel it. So it was reverberating, the grumble was reverberating through the shock somehow. Now be emotionally prepared for the rear shock assemblies / the rear struts, because even though there were a lot less steps, the steps themselves were much more difficult, including but not limited to the nuts holding on the entire assembly at the top. Getting to them was a pain, and actually inserting the bottom of the assemblies and the base bolts at the bottom. That was kind of a nightmare, not gonna lie, but we did it. It took 2 people. First step is PB blasting all the things we're about to remove. That includes the rear lower shock nut. If we follow the assembly up, basically it's only held in place by 4 nuts here. The 2 on the right, and 2 here. These 2, and these 2. So we're gonna give them a dose of PB Blaster. Then we're gonna remove them, and that's basically going to be the entire procedure for the rear shock spring assembly. To reach them all, I wore a ski mask and laid on my back right under there, which is coincidentally where all the PB Blaster falls onto your face. So definitely make sure to wear face protection to not get a face full of PB Blaster. And you're gonna have to get on your back, basically under the vehicle here, with a lot of extensions to get those upper bolts off. So this assembly, as you can see, to remove this assembly, we have to remove this before we completely remove the bolt. To remove this assembly, the end goal is to remove the bolt. In the process, we're going to try and remove the bolt and slide this off of the bolt at the bottom without damaging anything. So first we're going to get the shock bolt part of the way out. So the bolt does get pulled out. We need locking pliers for that. Grabbing it with some locking pliers and playing around with how much pressure we use with the jack.
We can use something to apply extra force.
And then 2 wrenches leveraged against each other to get it farther out.
And some more.
Enough to slide the sway bar link off of the shock bolt.
With the bolt out a decent amount of the way, enough to free up this shock absorber. And we just push this shock absorber off.
And just like the fronts, it helps to loosen the top bolt on the sway bar end link to be able to wiggle it how we need to.
So we broke it loose. 2. Start to get under. Not bad at all. There's a sway bar link. Bolt on the other side. Last but not least, we jack up the car a little bit. I'm getting all of our toys out of the way. Having relieved some of this pressure on the bolt, we should just be able to. And if it doesn't, that means we need to cleanse it a little more. Well, the bolt is out, and the threads are mostly okay. Probably not the best way to get it out though. Now we want to lower the jack. That is in there. Putting a rubber screwdriver and a mallet. Be careful not to hit the rotors, lovingly tapping it out. Gets the assembly out. Now the next step is those 4 bolts on a lot of extensions while wearing face protection under the car. And we're almost done basically.
So this is a reverse image.
And we can't really see what we're looking at, can we? This is what it looks like when you finally get the extension onto that far bolt. And it's a very tight fit for the swivels. So this impossible bolt, I got it by laying down under here, getting under the rotor here, sticking my thick extension, not the regular hex, but through over there, and getting under the car, and that way is how I broke that darn bolt loose. And it's a really tight fit. And the thick extensions, the large sockets, continue being large up until just the end. Standard hex sockets, a standard swivel because a large hex swivel doesn't fit. To give you an idea of the clearances, a regular swivel will fit. Just to give you an idea of clearances, this will fit, this will not. So that was a fun bolt. Goes through the bottom here and then just towards the back of the vehicle, and it pops right out. And you want to leave the last bolt in loosely, and then you finally, when all of them are loose, you get 3 of them out. You leave the last one in, then you take the last one out while holding it. Just playing with the extensions and different angles under the car. And there we go. For transferring the bracket, the new complete assembly comes with the 4 required nuts. And for alignment, I'm just going to pop this off, pop this onto the new one. And I made sure that this bottom here lines up. So if you flip this over, this is on the other side. So I literally lined them up the same way. I have the 2 arrows on the right, and just 4 nuts, and transfer it over. Now we will be aligning the bottom of the shock with the rear knuckle assembly and partially installing the bolt.
Hey everyone, so this is future Ruslan in post and while editing this video. This part turned out to be one of the hardest portions of this installation entirely, so feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter or to the end of this chapter to see how I solved this specific problem. You're about to see me struggling all kinds of ways. First, I thought I put the support bracket on backwards, so I flipped it back and forth. Then I realized I installed it correctly the first time, so I swapped it back. Then I realized that the complete unit assembly that I received, you're looking at it now, this is actually as expected. Not as expected, but it's not rare that they arrive crooked like this with a shock not easily insertable, but you're supposed to put in a screwdriver, and you're also supposed to disconnect other suspension components at will in order to successfully actually manage to get it into this knuckle. This step is not easy. This was complex on both sides of the car, and this was definitely not enjoyable.
The spring's the same way as the old shock assembly. At the bottom, it's actually angled the other way. This stage is a lot of getting under the car with pretty decent eye protection.
Here's me removing it and then flipping the support because I thought I installed it backwards. But that way it fit even worse. So aligning based on the rubber pads for the spring was actually the correct way to go.
I'm calling it a night because now it's not fitting at all. I'm tired.
With renewed spirits the next morning, we installed the upper mount the original way as we installed it the first time around.
So the solution is this one also isn't perfect. It's not angled the right way. And flipping it around 180 totally messes up the position. So this was right. The bed is down. The shock is movable, so we move it with a screwdriver, which is kind of sort of what we did with the front strut, but this is different for the rear. And we're gonna jack it up while applying pressure with a long lever here. I don't like it that you have to do this with this pre-installed kit, but if you do get the linked kit, be aware that this is something you will have to do. I do not know if you have to do this on all new kits. So we're torquing the top back to 44 foot-pounds. Then we're gonna twist it with a screwdriver with a jack underneath to insert into this fork because this fork is a little cozy. But luckily this ribbed.
Also taking a pause here, you can have one man stand on the rotor, open the rear door and actually put a foot and stand on the rotor with other suspension components disconnected to give you the clearance you might need to fit this fork over the shock. This is what added to the complexity of this step significantly. I did not film disconnecting the other suspension components on both sides, but I disconnected as indicated in the Pelican image above the bottom fork on one side, and I forget which other suspension component on the other side to actually give us the clearance we needed. Because even with one man standing on the rotor on either side, we did not get enough clearance and could not apply enough pressure to get the fork over the shock. So it wiggled down a few centimeters, but not completely. You're going to see me try to jack the shock into the fork from below, but actually stepping on the rotor gives you the clearance and the flexibility you need to get the fork over the shock.
So after some wrestling, if it still doesn't want to go in and doesn't compress how you want it while you're bending it, gets stuck on the shock itself, which is bad. So we were careful about not applying too much pressure, even though we scratched the paint. Then per the Pelican guide, if we observe, we can actually move this a little down, the wheel hub assembly. We can disconnect the upper and lower control arms. So we're gonna PB blast those and disconnect them.
I only had to disconnect the lower one, and alas, I did it from the wrong side. You want to do the bolts closer to the wheel hub, not from the car side.
And that should give us enough travel to pull the wheel hub down onto the shock while twisting it to get it in. Upper control link and lower control link.
As you watch this time lapse, you're going to see, well, once I get the bolts off, that you can actually, there's increased travel on this entire assembly. So it's, at least to me, it's pretty exciting. We can actually get this over the shock.
So not filmed, but this bolt and this lower bolt are reconnected. What helped is having one man open this door and actually stand inside and put a foot on this to apply a lot of force and press it down, not on its rotor cover. And then that way you get the shock in place, stick the bolt through, and that's how you get the bolt through. Then you just put the shock back on as well. And now we're gonna reinstall this last bolt, or last nut that we removed, the 18mm. All these other suspension components are 21mm. We're gonna jack it up and torque it down to 67 foot-pounds once jacked up to ride height.
With a jack under the lower control arm, we jack it up until the vehicle starts moving up. Then we stop lifting.
bolt on. Congratulations, you're done. Put the wheel back on and torque it down to 118 foot-pounds.
The left and right rear sides were equally as challenging with getting the entire knuckle on top of the new shock assembly. I disconnected different suspension components on the rear right side to see if there was a better way of doing it, but this is the side I incorrectly disconnected the bottom toe from the vehicle side rather than from the suspension side. And so you'll see that shortly. I'll link the PDF directions I used in the description below. It was actually based on lowering springs, so their guide was very helpful. But if you're using that guide, most of the difficulty with the rear shock strut assemblies stemmed from undocumented steps, like getting getting the shock back into the knuckle. Hence me making the video. All of the documented steps were actually very simple. So my shock was so out of place that when I stuck the screwdriver and applied enough force to twist it into position, it spun inside the mechanism. Let me know if it was supposed to do that, but now they are more or less aligned, so it's just a challenge. Here's an angle of it, more or less aligned. And not filmed was my very kind neighbor helping me again. So he opened the rear door, stepped with both feet and basically hung off of the rear rotor on the outside of it, and then with one man's entire weight of the rotor with suspension components disconnected. That gives enough travel to the entire assembly. Oh yeah, my headlights are out. Check out the headlight restoration video. But enough weight to actually get the rotor and the knuckle over the shock assembly. For the reinstallation on the right rear, it was as challenging, if not more challenging. We disconnected this, as it'll be labeled on screen, called the tow rod. And since I'm overdue for an alignment, I got the washer back where it belonged. The tires still look a little turned inwards, all four though. And then you drive away on your new suspension. So this is the end result height. Nice and tall in the back. A little settled in the front right, which makes sense because the engine's there. The rear settles when you're towing stuff. A little settled in the front left. Nice and high in the back as well. I don't think we needed new springs, but we definitely needed new shocks because it drove like a new car, and with 3 of the 4 done. And I can't wait to see what it feels like with 4 out of 4. Check out the headlight restoration video. The second layer is curing right now. I thought my Cayenne drove great, but after this procedure, it was a day and night difference. Going over potholes, it was rough prior to. Afterwards, I still feel potholes and inconsistencies in the road, but the shock absorbers do an amazing job, and it feels like floating on the road due to the shocks and the weight of the SUV. For semantics, you should know that after this procedure, you might have a crooked steering wheel, and you will need to get an alignment to address it.